Prequels so often don't... Nope. That was a bad idea. Prequels so often don't work. With prequels, you tend to get stories that either diminish themselves through the pre-existence of the next chapter, or diminish that next chapter. Indeed, they often do both. To have a prequel be good, you essentially have to ensure that it and the original work are enhanced by the existence of this prequel. And, well, writing a good story is hard on its own, let alone attempting to write a story that is improved by and improves the original work. One story, though, that I've experienced recently manages to do exactly this. Red Dead Redemption 2's brilliance as a prequel lies in the many ways its events deepen the thematic depth of the events of Red Dead Redemption 1, and vice versa. For example, the protagonist of the first game, John Marston, his quest to kill or capture his former gang members in Red Dead Redemption 1 is made all the more poignant because we see the brotherhood that existed between these gang members in Red Dead Redemption 2. And due to our knowledge of Red Dead Redemption 1, we know that John is going to ultimately kill some of these people you see him fight alongside in Red Dead Redemption 2. And this gives all of his interactions with these people in Red Dead Redemption 2 more weight. I've seen people talk about Red Dead Redemption 2, saying that it runs into some of the same problems as the other prequels I've mentioned in this video, and that's valid. I mean, the storytelling possibilities of Red Dead Redemption 2 are decreased by what we know comes next, and our impressions of the redemptive ending of this game cannot remain unaffected by our knowledge of the tragic ending of the first game. So before we get too far into this, let's go back and do a bit of painless plot summary first. In Red Dead Redemption 2, we play as Arthur Morgan, the protagonist, a violent man who has lived a violent life working as a strongman for the Dutch Van der Linde gang. Over the course of the game, he becomes disillusioned with Dutch and his whole way of life, and ultimately turns against Dutch and gives his life to help some of his fellow gang members escape the gang. The narrative focuses especially on his attempts to save gang member John Marston and John Marston's family. After Arthur's death, our control switches to John Marston, who, instead of leaving his violent way of life behind, chases down and kills the man who killed Arthur, which has the unfortunate consequence of leading law enforcement agent Edgar Ross to John. In Red Dead Redemption 1, having found John Marston, Edgar Ross forces John to hunt down some of his surviving ex-gang members, which he does. Edgar Ross, however, won't let John live out a happy life on the farm with his family, and the gang ends with John dying to allow his family to leave once and for all the outlaw life. In an epilogue, we see a few years later that John's son Jack, instead of living out a peaceful life, takes up the outlaw mantle in order to avenge his father's death, which he does when he kills Edgar Ross. And the cyclical nature of the violence we've experienced over the course of these two games goes on and on. Now, just from that plot summary, you might start to see some of the problems people have identified with Red Dead Redemption 2's position as a prequel. Though Red Dead Redemption 2 on its own gives some impression that Arthur's noble sacrifice is of the kind we're used to, as in it sets just about everything right, our knowledge of Red Dead Redemption 1 means that we know everything does not turn out right. We are confronted with the idea that Arthur's sacrifice might have been in vain. Indeed, while Arthur does successfully save some people in the gang, as we see during the credits montage, the main narrative thrust of this last third or so of the game is Arthur saving John and his family, which is something that ultimately doesn't work. John and Jack aren't saved from the violent, destructive life that claims Arthur. They continue in this life that we know leads to death. We've seen it happen to countless gang members, we've seen it happen to Arthur, we see it happen to John in Red Dead Redemption 1, and we have no reason to doubt that it will lead to Jack's death too. Jack, the one who seems most capable of leaving this life behind, mirrors the decision his father made to avenge a loved one's murder, a decision that, when made by both father and son, explicitly leads to a continuation of the outlaw life. Indeed, just before Arthur dies, Arthur warns John, basically, not to do something like this.
Brother, I want you to not look back. Like I said.
Red Dead Redemption 2 spends so much time examining and giving weight to Arthur's sacrifice that we cannot simply throw it out as irrelevant in light of what comes next. But knowing what comes next prevents us from coming to facile conclusions about its meaning. In essence, the game is using its position as a prequel to make us think more critically about the meaning of its ending. I think that perhaps the most important way we can view Arthur's sacrifice is to stray slightly from the idea of it being a success or failure. And instead, maybe we can look at the act of sacrifice as an act unto itself, somewhat detached from its ultimate effects. In order to give Arthur's sacrifice a bit more thematic context, I'm going to take a bit of a hard left turn and start looking at some Lord of the Rings. And yes, I am sneaking some Tolkien into a video on Red Dead Redemption, and yes, this will probably happen again in future videos. Now, in the Middle-earth, there are many acts of heroism that are, in a purely practical sense, fairly useless. A good example of this would be the self-sacrifice of Boromir, who pulls himself away from the corrupting power of the One Ring and dies protecting his hobbit friends from the Uruk-hai. And if you need some explanation of what those words are, maybe just look at a wiki or something. I frankly don't know how to summarize Tolkien lore. Maybe Boromir delays his enemies enough to help Aragorn and other members of the Fellowship catch up to the hobbits. But probably not. His death does not really affect that much change. Nonetheless, Boromir does redeem himself here. He commits an act of amazing strength, overcoming the power of the ring, and dies fighting for his friends. He, like Arthur Morgan, does not cause everything to turn out right through self-sacrifice, as his friends are ultimately captured by their enemies. But he does die giving his all for what is right and just. I think we might be able to expand upon this concept of self-sacrifice with a quote from Gandalf in The Return of the King. He states, "It is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule." Importantly, Gandalf says this as he and his companions are planning their final stand against the forces of evil, a fight they will almost certainly lose, but one they must fight anyway to resist the domination of Sauron, who will just say, for purposes of simplicity, is a very bad individual. There are two really important concepts to the morality of the Lord of the Rings, and these are domination and free will. Those who dominate free will are evil, and those who fight to free the wills of others are heroes. And it's a bit more complicated than that, but I'm trying to keep this video under like 20 minutes. Now, Gandalf recognizes here that everything could go wrong, even if they defeat Sauron, which, again, remains extremely unlikely. And throughout the history of Tolkien's world, there have been heroic successes followed by periods of unimaginable evil. bigger baddies than Sauron had been defeated before, and yet the world at this point in the story is still close to being overrun with evil yet again. And yet, this sacrifice is worth making, because they will have done their duty to those who come next. They will have fought to enable those who come next to avoid domination and be allowed to make their own choices. I think we see this way of looking at self-sacrifice mirrored in Arthur's sacrifice. He cannot see what the characters he saves will do next, but what he can do is fight for them and try to enable them to make their own choices rather than be bound and dominated by the violent life many of them have been forced into. And I think this ultimately is what is redemptive about his actions. Whereas he was a strong man before, forcing people to bend to the gang's will, he now enables people to make their own choices, freeing their futures in a way that would not be possible if Arthur did not take this stand. Arthur does redeem himself then, not because his death fixes everything or stops the cycle of violence that he hoped to end for the Marston family, not even because his actions achieve success in the short term, which they do, but rather because he leaves behind his attempts to dominate others and instead tries to offer those around him a choice about how to live their lives. He works to let them escape domination, even if some of them just imprison themselves again. This is, I think, where Arthur's sacrifice can be most instructive to us. Because much like Arthur, we cannot see what will happen next. We do not, in our day-to-day existence, have the godlike powers that narrative grants us, to see past tomorrow, to see past death, and to take stock of the world from an elevated vantage point. Our efforts, our own sacrifices, should be focused on the good of others. But much like Arthur, we have little way of knowing what the outcome of our acts of heroism might be. But we can act heroically, and should, because heroism and self-sacrifice must often be outcome independent. And that heroic effort, from our distinctly limited vantage point, can be enough. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this, do the whole like, subscribe thing. But more importantly, I'd like to hear your thoughts. If you played this game, what did you think about Arthur's sacrifice? Do you think maybe I'm onto something here, or do you have a different perspective on it? Because I'd love to hear it. Especially if you played the game differently than I did. It being a video game, I think it's entirely possible to have a completely different experience of this ending just based on the way you play most of the game. So I'd love to hear about that. And I don't know, if you can think of any good prequels, go ahead and list those in the comments. And until next time, be well, and I'll talk to you soon.